The story of Las Vegas is inextricably woven with the life and death of one man, a paradox of a human being who was equal parts ruthless gangster and starry-eyed visionary, a man named Benjamin Siegel, though the world would come to know him, much to his profound irritation, as Bugsy. To understand the monumental nature of his dream, one must first erase from their mind the dazzling, electric city that exists today, the sky-piercing hotels, the endless cacophony of slots, the grand spectacles of performance and light. One must instead picture a vast, silent, and unforgiving desert basin, a sun-scorched expanse of dust and scrubrush, where the only constants were the relentless heat and the howling wind. This was the Las Vegas of the 1940s, a sleepy railroad town with a few dusty streets, a handful of saloons catering to railroad workers, and absolutely no reason for anyone to ever visit, let alone build an empire. It was in this profound emptiness that Benjamin Siegel saw a future of unimaginable opulence and sin, a paradise for the wealthy and the wicked, a place where the normal rules of society did not apply and every forbidden desire could be indulged. His journey to this epiphany, however, began not in the desert, but in the teeming, overcrowded, and brutally competitive tenements of New York's Lower East Side, a world away in every conceivable sense. Born on February 28, 1906, to impoverished Jewish immigrants from Austria, his childhood was a masterclass in deprivation and the desperate struggle for survival. The American dream, for those in the squalid tenements, was not a promise but a taunt, and young Benjamin, handsome, fiercely intelligent, and brimming with a restless, destructive energy, quickly realized that the legitimate paths to success were closed, slow, and demeaning. He wanted wealth, power, and respect, and he wanted them immediately, with a burning impatience that would come to define his entire life. The streets of Williamsburg, Brooklyn, became his university, and his curriculum was petty crime. He formed a gang with another ambitious young man, Meyer Lansky, and together they embarked on a career of minor thefts, protection rackets, and rolling drunkards. It was here, in these formative years, that he earned the nickname that would haunt him forever, Bugsy. In the slang of the era, Bugs meant crazy, and Siegel had earned it through his volatile, unpredictable temper and a willingness to resort to breathtaking violence at the slightest provocation, a trait that both terrified and impressed his contemporaries. He despised the name, considering it cheap and vulgar, a label for a common hoodlum, and he would fly into a rage if anyone dared use it to his face. He saw himself as a businessman, a sophisticate, a man of taste and refinement, and this disconnect between his self-image and his brutal reality would be a central tension throughout his life. As Prohibition descended upon America in 1920, it presented an unprecedented opportunity for young men like Siegel and Lansky. Their small-time street gang evolved into a sophisticated, ruthless criminal enterprise known as the Bugs and Meyer mob, which specialized in car thefts for bootleggers and contract killings. Their efficiency and brutality did not go unnoticed. They were soon absorbed into the burgeoning national crime syndicate, a shadowy consortium of gangs that would later be romanticized as the National Crime Syndicate, working alongside figures like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello. Siegel became one of the syndicate's most feared and effective enforcers, a primary operative for its assassination squad known colloquially as Murder Incorporated. He was handsome, charming, and impeccably dressed, but beneath that polished exterior was a cold-blooded killer who personally executed numerous rivals and informants. This duality was his shield and his weapon. He could disarm you with a movie, star smile one moment, and put a bullet in your brain the next. His reputation for ruthless efficiency, coupled with his ambition, made him a rising star in the underworld. But Siegel was not content to remain a mere soldier, no matter how feared. He looked at the vast criminal empire he was helping to build and saw its limitations. He dreamed of something bigger, something legitimate, something that would grant him not just wealth and power, but the one thing that always seemed to elude him, respectability. And so, seeking new horizons and fleeing the intense heat of an East Coast gang war, the syndicate looked west, to the sprawling, open, and largely lawless landscape of California. It was a move that would change everything. For Benjamin Siegel, for the syndicate, and for the very map of American entertainment. He was sent to Los Angeles to develop the syndicate's West Coast operations, which primarily involved wresting control of the race wire services, the lifeblood of illegal gambling, from local outfits. But for Siegel, Los Angeles was more than just a new territory to conquer. It was a gateway to a world he had only seen on the silver screen. Los Angeles in the late 1930s was a city of shimmering illusions, a place where dreams were manufactured on soundstages and reality was carefully curated for public consumption. For Benjamin Siegel, it was the perfect new home, a stage upon which he could finally enact his vision of himself as a legitimate tycoon and a man of high society. He arrived not as a gangster from the mean streets of Brooklyn, but as Ben Siegel, a wealthy and charismatic businessman. He settled his family, his wife Esta and their 2 daughters, into a magnificent mansion in the newly fashionable and exclusive neighborhood of Beverly Hills, a sprawling estate that he named, with typical grandiosity, the Maison de Siege. He immersed himself in the world of Hollywood glamour, using his syndicate-backed wealth to buy his way into the inner circles of the film industry. He became a fixture at the most exclusive nightclubs and restaurants, always impeccably dressed, always surrounded by an entourage of beautiful starlets and powerful men. He cultivated friendships with some of the biggest names in Hollywood, including actors like George Raft, who had often played gangsters on screen and was fascinated by the real thing, and studio head Jack Warner. Siegel loved the attention and the proximity to fame. He relished being seen as a peer by the very people he had once watched from a distance in a dark movie theater. He invested in legitimate businesses, including a company that made racing forms, and even had a fleeting, uncredited involvement in a few films, but his primary business remained, as always, the business of crime. He successfully muscled control of the Trans-America Race Wire Service, giving the syndicate a stranglehold on the flow of gambling information to bookmakers across the western United States. He also became deeply involved in offshore gambling, establishing a sophisticated floating casino on a ship called the Rex, which operated just beyond the 3-mile limit off the coast of Santa Monica. But despite the success of these ventures, a deep-seated restlessness began to gnaw at him. The life of a Hollywood playboy, while enjoyable, felt increasingly hollow. He was still just a cog in the syndicate machine, a highly decorated and well-paid cog, but a cog nonetheless. He yearned to create something that was entirely his own, a monument that would bear his name and cement his legacy not as a gangster, but as a builder, a pioneer. It was during this period of searching for a grander purpose that he first heard whispers of a potential opportunity in a place he had previously considered a worthless backwater, Nevada. For years, his associate and fellow syndicate member, Meyer Lansky, had been taking the cure at the hot springs in a small town called Las Vegas, and he would report back about the potential he saw there. Nevada was the only state in the Union where gambling was legal, a fact that had given rise to a few small, rustic, and decidedly unglamorous casinos in downtown Las Vegas, places like the Northern Club and the Apache Hotel, which catered to a clientele of locals, railroad workers, and the occasional adventurous tourist. They were functional, profitable in a modest way, but they were a universe away from the sophistication and glamour Siegel envisioned. The initial suggestion was for Siegel to simply go and oversee the syndicate's existing minor interests there. But when he finally made the trip to see it for himself, driving the long, lonely highway from Los Angeles across the Mojave Desert, he did not see the sleepy, dusty little town that everyone else saw. As his car pulled onto Fremont Street, he looked past the few blinking lights of the primitive casinos, past the low, slung buildings and the tumbleweeds blowing across the road. He stared out into the vast, empty darkness beyond the town, and in that darkness, he saw a vision. He didn't see a few more casinos. He saw a sprawling, self-contained resort of unimaginable luxury rising from the desert like a mirage. He saw a destination that would attract the very same Hollywood elite he socialized with, a place where they could escape the prying eyes of the press and indulge in high-stakes gambling, world-class entertainment, and unparalleled luxury. He saw a place that would make the downtown clubs look like the pathetic roadside attractions they were. This was not merely a business proposition. It was an obsession, a calling. He knew, with a certainty that bordered on religious fervor, that he was the only one who could see this future, the only one with the vision and the audacity to build it. The instrument for this dream already existed, at least in a rudimentary, struggling form, on a patch of barren desert several miles outside the town limits. A man named Billy Wilkerson, the founder of The Hollywood Reporter, had begun construction on a hotel and casino. Wilkerson was a gambler himself, both at the tables and in business, and he had run out of money. The project, named the Flamingo, was stalled, a skeleton of steel and concrete baking uselessly in the relentless sun. For Siegel, it was a sign from fate. He approached Wilkerson, and with the full financial backing of the syndicate. He bought a controlling interest in the project. He assured his partners in New York and Chicago, men like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello, that this was a golden opportunity, a surefire way to launder their vast illicit profits and generate an endless river of clean, legal cash. He promised them a return on their investment that would dwarf anything they had ever seen. They were skeptical. The desert was a wasteland, and his idea of building a luxury resort in the middle of nowhere seemed like madness. But Siegel was a convincing salesman, and his passion, combined with his track record of success, was enough to secure the initial funding. The money began to flow from the East Coast, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then millions, all funneled into the barren patch of Nevada desert. The Flamingo was no longer Billy Wilkerson's struggling project. It was now Benjamin Siegel's destiny, and he would pour his soul, and ultimately his life's blood, into its foundation. With the Flamingo now firmly under his control, Benjamin Siegel's vision began to crystallize with an intensity that bordered on mania, transforming him from a charismatic businessman into a single-minded autocrat consumed by his creation. He was no longer merely building a casino. He was sculpting a mirage into reality, forcing his will upon the indifferent desert. The initial, modest plans drawn up by Billy Wilkerson were immediately discarded as hopelessly provincial and inadequate for the grander Siegel envisioned. In his mind's eye, the Flamingo was to be nothing less than the most luxurious and sophisticated resort on earth, a place that would rival the finest hotels of Monte Carlo and the swankiest nightclubs of Hollywood, all combined into one self-contained paradise. He envisioned a sprawling, U-shaped complex of buildings in the sleek, streamlined modern style, painted a dazzling white, with elegant curves and clean lines that would stand in stark, beautiful contrast to the rugged desert landscape. The main casino would be a vast, opulent room with high, vaulted ceilings, its air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and fine tobacco, the constant, soft clatter of chips, and the whirring of roulette wheels providing a symphony of wealth. It would be surrounded by 125 lavishly appointed hotel rooms, each one a suite with plush carpeting, custom-made furniture, and a private bathroom, an unheard of luxury for any hotel in Nevada at the time. Beyond the main building, he dreamed of lush, tropical gardens, a spectacle of emerald green against the desert's tan, with towering palm trees imported at staggering cost, meandering pathways, and a swimming pool of Olympic proportions, its water a brilliant, impossible blue, surrounded by cabanas where the rich and famous could lounge in secluded splendor. He wanted a championship, level golf course carved from the arid earth, a stable of purebred horses for guests to ride, and a private airstrip to ferry in his high, rolling clients directly from Los Angeles, bypassing the common roads altogether. Every single detail, from the pattern on the china in the gourmet restaurant to the cut of the uniforms worn by the bellhops, was subjected to his obsessive scrutiny and his insatiable demand for perfection. He wanted only the finest materials. Regardless of cost, or the logistical nightmare of transporting them to the middle of nowhere. Marble was shipped from Italy, crystal chandeliers from Czechoslovakia, the finest silks and brocades for draperies and upholstery from New York. He personally approved every fabric swatch, every paint sample, every piece of furniture. This obsessive attention to detail, while born from a genuine desire for excellence, soon became the project's greatest liability. The initial budget, which he had confidently presented to the syndicate, was almost immediately obliterated. The cost of the imported materials was astronomical. The labor costs soared as crews worked around the clock. Driven by Siegel's relentless, impatient demands, he was a terrifying presence on the construction site, a whirlwind of fury and inspiration. One moment he could be charming, inspiring the workers with his vision of the glorious future they were building together. The next, he would fly into a violent rage if he noticed a single tile out of place or a delay of any kind. His temper, always volatile, became legendary. He would scream at architects, fire contractors on the spot, and there were whispered rumors, never proven but widely believed, of physical threats and acts of intimidation against anyone who questioned his decisions or presented him with an inconvenient reality, such as a budget report. The original construction team was soon replaced, and Siegel brought in Del Webb, a rising construction magnate, to take over, believing he could better handle the breakneck pace and complex demands. But even Webb struggled to control the spiraling costs and Siegel's ever-expanding vision. The syndicate back in New York, primarily Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, grew increasingly anxious as the financial reports came in. The initial investment of $1 million was gone. Then $2 million, and still the project was far from complete. They sent their own accountants to Las Vegas to scrutinize the books, but Siegel, paranoid and possessive, surrounded himself with his own loyalists, including his childhood friend and syndicate accountant, Alan Smiley, making it difficult for the East Coast bosses to get a clear picture of where their money was going. Suspicion began to fester. Was their money being stolen? Was Siegel skimming from the top, funding his lavish Hollywood lifestyle with their capital? Or was he simply incompetent, a dreamer in over his head? The line between embezzlement and catastrophic financial mismanagement became dangerously blurred. Siegel, for his part, was utterly convinced of his own infallibility. He viewed the syndicate's concerns as the short-sighted worries of small-minded men who could not see the masterpiece he was creating. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that the moment the Flamingo opened its doors, it would be such an instantaneous and overwhelming success that all the debt would be wiped out in a matter of months, and the profits would be so immense that his partners would forget their doubts and hail him as a genius. This unshakable faith blinded him to the peril he was in. He continued to spend with reckless abandon, pouring more and more of the mob's money into his desert dream, digging a financial hole so deep that it was beginning to look like a grave. The pressure mounted not only from his backers, but from his personal life. His marriage to Esta, strained for years by his infidelities and his obsession with the Flamingo, finally collapsed. He began a very public, tumultuous affair with the beautiful and notorious Virginia Hill, a woman with her own mysterious connections to the underworld, whose extravagant spending and fiery temper matched his own. Together, they became the king and queen of this nascent desert kingdom, living in a rented house near the construction site, their lives a whirlwind of arguments, reconciliations, and lavish parties, all set against the backdrop of the rising, unfinished hotel, a monument to ambition that was slowly becoming a tombstone. The pressure from the syndicate evolved from a distant murmur of concern into a deafening roar of ultimatums, a storm cloud gathering over the desert that even Benjamin Siegel's boundless optimism could no longer ignore. The financial bleeding had become a hemorrhage. The initial $1 million investment had ballooned to over $4 million, a sum so vast in 1946 that it was almost incomprehensible, and still, the Flamingo was a labyrinth of unfinished rooms, bare concrete, and tangled wiring, a palace of promises perpetually on the verge of completion, but never quite reaching it. Meyer Lansky, the voice of cold, pragmatic reason within the syndicate, found himself in an increasingly difficult position. Torn between his lifelong friendship with Siegel and his fiduciary duty to the other powerful and increasingly homicidal investors who were demanding answers and, more importantly, a return on their capital, Lansky dispatched a series of envoys to Las Vegas, men like Gus Greenbaum and Mo Sedway, not just to observe but to actively intervene, to impose some semblance of order on the financial chaos and to deliver a clear, unequivocal message to Siegel. The blank checks were gone, the open-ended funding had ceased, and he was to open the hotel immediately, in whatever state it was in, to start generating revenue and stem the tidal wave of debt. Siegel received these directives not as sound business advice, but as a personal insult and a direct challenge to his authority. He saw Lansky's men as interlopers sent to spy on him and to steal the credit for his vision. His paranoia, always simmering just beneath the surface of his polished charm, now boiled over into open hostility. He barred them from the construction site, refused them access to the detailed books, and surrounded himself with a cadre of loyalists who were loyal only to him, men who fed his ego and insulated him from the grim reality of his situation. He argued, with a logic that was both compelling and utterly delusional, that to open prematurely would be a catastrophic mistake. The Flamingo had to be perfect, he insisted. Its debut had to be a flawless, breathtaking spectacle that would instantly establish its legend. A half-finished hotel with construction dust still settling on the roulette tables would be ridiculed by the Hollywood crowd. He warned, and it would doom the project to permanent mediocrity. He needed just a little more time, just a little more money, to cross the finish line in the style he had always envisioned. This intransigence was the final straw for many of the backers. The whispers, which had once been about incompetence, now turned decisively towards treachery. The theory that Siegel and his fiery mistress Virginia Hill were systematically embezzling, the funds gained powerful traction. Hill was known to make frequent, large cash deposits into Swiss bank accounts, and her extravagant spending on furs, jewels, and international travel, all funded by Siegel, seemed to provide tangible proof of their theft. The syndicate's patience, a commodity that had always been in short supply, was now exhausted. A meeting was convened, a council of war held in a smoky room far from the Nevada sun, where the fate of Benjamin Siegel was debated. The old bonds of friendship, the shared memories of street corners in Brooklyn, held little weight against the cold, hard calculus of $4 million vanished dollars. The decision was not yet a death sentence, but it was a firm and final verdict. The Flamingo would open on the date they set, December 26, 1946, ready or not. Siegel was to be cut off from all further funding. He was to be sidelined, with effective control of the project handed over to Lansky's more reliable lieutenants. It was a humiliating demotion, a public stripping of his power, and for a man whose ego was as vast as the desert itself, it was an unbearable punishment. When this decree was delivered to him, Siegel erupted in a fury that was terrifying to behold. He felt betrayed by Lansky, the one man he had considered a true brother. He saw himself as a visionary being crucified by Philistines who cared only for the bottom line. But, cornered and out of options, he had no choice but to acquiesce. The frantic push to meet the imposed deadline began, a chaotic, round-the-clock frenzy of activity that sacrificed the last vestiges of quality and planning for the sake of mere completion. The grand vision was hacked to pieces. The lush gardens were a patchwork of immature plants and bare dirt. The Olympic pool was filled, but the surrounding area was a construction zone. Many of the hotel rooms were still uninhabitable, their furniture still in crates, their bathrooms missing fixtures. The entire complex was a beautiful shell, a magnificent facade hiding a core of chaos and compromise. But Siegel, ever the showman, was determined to put on the performance of his life. He leveraged every last one of his Hollywood connections, calling in favors and deploying his considerable charm to convince a galaxy of stars to attend the grand opening. He poured what little money he had left, and likely a great deal more that wasn't his, into securing the biggest names in entertainment for the Flamingo's debut. He booked the legendary comedian and actor Jimmy Durante to headline the show, and the famous bandleader Xavier Cugat to provide the music. It was a Herculean effort, a testament to his power and influence in the entertainment world. On the evening of December 26, 1946, the long-awaited night finally arrived. The desert air was unseasonably cold as a convoy of sleek, expensive cars, carrying Hollywood's most famous faces, made the long drive from Los Angeles to the strange, new oasis rising from the darkness. The women were draped in diamonds and furs, the men in tuxedos, all arriving to witness the birth of Benjamin Siegel's dream. From the outside, under the glare of powerful spotlights, the Flamingo looked stunning, a mirage made real. The white walls gleamed, the sign blazed with light, and the air was filled with a sense of momentous occasion. Siegel stood at the entrance, the picture of success, greeting his guests with a confident smile, every inch the visionary host. But as the guests stepped inside, the illusion began to fray at the edges. The smell of fresh paint and wet plaster was overwhelming. There were visible signs of rushed construction everywhere. And then the final, cruel twist of fate, the weather. The one variable no amount of money or influence could control turned against him. A fierce winter storm descended upon the desert, bringing torrential rains and howling winds that lashed against the new building. The roads back to Los Angeles, precarious at the best of times, became impassable rivers of mud, stranding the Hollywood elite in a hotel that was not yet ready to host them. There were not enough finished rooms, not enough hot water, not enough of anything. The glamorous party descended into a chaotic, miserable scene of crowded lobbies and disgruntled guests. And then, the ultimate humiliation, the casino itself, the very heart of the Flamingo, began to lose money. The high rollers from Hollywood, a notoriously superstitious bunch, saw the bad weather and the unfinished state of the hotel as terrible omens. They gambled cautiously, if at all. The tables were eerily quiet at the end of the opening weekend. Instead of the massive profit Siegel had promised, the Flamingo had lost a staggering amount of money. The grand opening was a spectacular, very public, and very expensive failure. The dream had collided with reality, and the dream had shattered. The news of the debacle raced back to the East Coast, confirming every worst fear the syndicate had ever held. For Benjamin Siegel, the man who had bet everything on this single night, it was the beginning of the end. The aftermath of the Flamingo's catastrophic opening was a silence more deafening than any explosion, a heavy, suffocating pall of failure that settled over the gleaming white complex and its disgraced creator. For Benjamin Siegel, the weeks that followed were a slow-motion nightmare, a descent from the pinnacle of his anticipated triumph into a chasm of humiliation, debt, and paranoia. The Hollywood crowd, whose approval he craved more than anything, had fled back to Los Angeles. Their reports filled not with awe for his vision, but with scornful anecdotes about the unfinished rooms, the overwhelming stench of paint, and the disastrous weather. He had become a laughingstock in the very circles he had worked so hard to conquer. His name synonymous not with visionary genius, but with reckless folly. The financial reality was even more brutal. The Flamingo, having bled millions during its construction, was now bleeding even more profusely in its operation. With its reputation in tatters, the tourists and gamblers stayed away in droves, preferring the established, if less glamorous, downtown casinos. The casino floor, designed for bustling crowds and the constant music of clinking chips, was a vast, echoing chamber of emptiness, occupied only by a few desultory local players and dealers standing idle at their tables, their faces masks of bored anxiety. The revenue was a trickle, not even enough to cover the astronomical daily operating costs, let alone service the mountain of debt owed to the syndicate. Every day the doors remained open. Siegel's failure became more profound and more irreversible. The pressure from the East Coast ceased to be a series of angry telegrams and stern warnings. It became a tangible, physical presence. Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum, the men Siegel had once contemptuously dismissed, returned to Las Vegas, but this time they did not come to advise or to plead. They came with the full, grim authority of the syndicate behind them. They were there to take control, to seize the asset that their money had built, and to salvage what they could from the wreckage of Siegel's ambition. They moved with a cold efficiency that excluded him entirely, taking over the management offices, installing their own accountants, and effectively freezing him out of the operation he had given his life to. Siegel was now a king without a kingdom, a ghost haunting the halls of his own palace. He would pace the empty casino floor, his handsome face a thundercloud of rage and despair, his presence an uncomfortable reminder of the project's troubled origins that the new managers were desperate to erase. His tirades, once feared by contractors and architects, now carried no weight. He was ignored, sidelined, a figurehead stripped of all power. This impotence was a poison to his soul. He began to spend less and less time at the Flamingo, retreating instead to the rented house he shared with Virginia Hill on Linden Drive in Beverly Hills, a home that had become a fortress for his simmering resentment and a bunker against the world he was certain was closing in on him. His relationship with Hill, always volatile, became a pressure cooker of its own. They fought with a ferocity that frightened the household staff, their arguments a toxic mix of financial terror, mutual recrimination, and the intense, destructive passion that had always defined their bond. Hill, who was deeply entangled in the financial mysteries of the Flamingo's funding and her own suspicious banking activities, began to make plans to travel to Europe, ostensibly to shop and to visit family, but the timing seemed to Siegel and to the watching syndicate like a preparative flight. His paranoia, once a character trait, now became his entire reality. He was convinced that his phone was tapped, that he was being followed, that every unfamiliar face in his neighborhood was a hired assassin sent by his former friends. He started carrying a gun at all times, his hand often drifting to check its presence. A nervous tic that betrayed the constant fear that had become his constant companion. He reached out to Meyer Lansky, his last frayed thread to the old days, pleading for more time, for one more chance, his voice a desperate echo of the confident young man from Brooklyn. But Lansky, the ultimate pragmatist, knew that the numbers were incontrovertible and that the syndicate's verdict was final. The friendship, which had survived decades of gang wars and prison sentences, could not survive a $4 million deficit. Lansky's responses were polite, evasive, and devoid of the old camaraderie. The lifeline had been cut. In a final, desperate gamble to reclaim his destiny, Siegel made a decision. He would close the Flamingo. It was a move of stunning audacity, a complete admission that the current operation was a failure, but he framed it to himself as a strategic retreat. He would shut down the hotel and casino, use the time to finally complete the construction to his original, exacting standards, and then reopen with a second grand opening that would erase the memory of the first. It was a colossal risk, requiring even more capital to finish the work while generating zero income. But for Siegel, it was the only path forward that allowed him to cling to his vision. He somehow managed to secure a short-term loan, though from whom remains a mystery, to fund this last-ditch effort. In February 1947, just 7 weeks after its infamous debut, the lights of the Flamingo were dimmed and its doors were locked. The silence that fell over the building was absolute. To the outside world, and especially to the syndicate bosses in New York, this was the final, irrefutable proof of Benjamin Siegel's madness. He had taken their millions, built a monument to his own ego, driven it into bankruptcy, and now, in an act of supreme defiance, had closed it down, demanding they wait even longer for a return that would never come. In their eyes, the man was no longer an asset, a partner, or even a liability. He had become a problem. And in their world, there was only one permanent solution to a problem of that magnitude. The order was given. The machinery of his execution, which had been slowly grinding into motion for months, now moved with a swift and silent finality. Benjamin Siegel, the visionary, had run out of time, out of options, and out of friends. He was now simply a target. The final act of Benjamin Siegel's life unfolded with the grim, inexorable logic of a Greek tragedy. A slow march toward a violent destiny that he seemed to sense, but was powerless to avoid. The spring and early summer of 1947 were a period of suspended animation, a strange and tense interlude, where the surface of his life maintained a semblance of normality, while the foundations crumbled beneath his feet. With the Flamingo shuttered and silent, its skeletal gardens and empty pool baking under the returning desert sun, Siegel divided his time between his Beverly Hills fortress and Las Vegas, where he would supervise the frantic, last-gasp construction efforts with a manic energy that fooled no one. He was a man racing against an invisible clock, pouring his remaining resources and his frayed spirit into proving his critics wrong, into demonstrating that his vision had been right all along. He drove the construction crews mercilessly, demanding perfection, obsessing over the most minute details, as if the very quality of the drapery or the grout between the tiles could somehow ward off the judgment that was coming. During this time, he was acutely aware of the target on his back. His paranoia was no longer a symptom. It was a rational assessment of his situation. He confided to a few trusted associates, in moments of bleak honesty, that he knew his former partners were going to kill him. He spoke of specific threats, of ominous messages passed through intermediaries, his voice a low, tense whisper filled with a chilling certainty. He took elaborate, almost theatrical precautions. He hired a personal bodyguard, a man named Flippy, who shadowed his every move. He varied his routes between Los Angeles and Las Vegas erratically, sometimes driving himself at high speed down deserted back roads, his eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror for pursuers. At the house on Linden Drive, he had an elaborate security system installed and was known to peer through the curtains for long minutes before stepping outside, his hand never far from the pistol nestled in his shoulder holster. Yet, intertwined with this pervasive fear was a stubborn, unkillable thread of hope. He truly believed that if he could just get the Flamingo reopened, if he could just show them the profits, the river of cash that would inevitably flow from a perfectly finished resort, he could still reverse his fate. This desperate hope became his sole reason for living. His personal life was in similar ruins. His relationship with Virginia Hill had deteriorated into a series of spectacular, public blowouts. Hill, sensing the impending doom with the same animal instinct that had always guided her through the underworld, was making frantic preparations to leave the country. She had already shipped vast sums of money to Swiss bank accounts and was finalizing plans for an extended trip to Europe, a flight that Siegel interpreted as both a personal betrayal and a confirmation of his darkest financial suspicions. Their arguments now were less about passion and more about survival, each accusing the other of precipitating the disaster that was about to consume them. On June 20th, 1947, the day of his assassination, the threads of his life converged into a single, taut line. Virginia Hill had flown to Paris days earlier, a move that undoubtedly sealed his fate in the minds of the syndicate, as it confirmed their belief that she had stolen their money and was now making her escape. Siegel, however, was in an uncharacteristically buoyant mood. He had spent the day in Las Vegas, and the news from the Flamingo was finally, miraculously, good. The renovations were nearly complete, and the building was more stunning than ever. More importantly, he had received preliminary financial reports that showed, for the first time, a glimmer of profitability from the few operational areas. It was a tiny flicker of light, but for a man who had been living in utter darkness, it was a beacon. He felt a surge of his old confidence. He decided to return to Los Angeles that evening to meet with an associate, his friend Alan Smiley, believing that he could now present a compelling case for more time, that he could turn the tide. He drove back to Beverly Hills, arriving at the Linden Drive house in the early evening. The house was quiet, occupied only by his friend and business partner, Alan Smiley, and Siegel's associate, Mae Green, Virginia Hill's sister. The scene was domestic, almost peaceful. Siegel moved through the elegant living room, its large picture window offering a view of the quiet, affluent street, a window he had so often peered through with suspicion, but which on this night he left unguarded. His mind, perhaps clouded by the first hopeful thoughts he'd entertained in months. He sat on a chintz-covered sofa, positioned directly in front of that large window, and began to read the Los Angeles Evening Herald Express. Smiley sat nearby. They discussed the Flamingo. And Siegel, animated by the day's positive developments, talked enthusiastically about the future, about the grand reopening, about finally proving everyone wrong. He was, in that moment, not a terrified gangster awaiting execution, but a businessman planning his comeback, his eyes alight with the reflection of the neon future he still believed in. He could not have known that his fate had already been signed, sealed, and delivered. At approximately 10:30 p.m., as he sat reading in that pool of lamplight, fully visible from the street, a figure, or perhaps multiple figures, moved through the darkness outside. From the relative cover of a hibiscus bush in the neighboring yard, a military grade M1 carbine was raised and aimed directly at Siegel's head. There was no warning, no knock on the door, no final confrontation. The night was shattered by the rapid, precise report of 9 shots fired in quick succession through the large window. The first bullet, fired with sniper-like accuracy, struck Siegel in the head, killing him instantly. His body was thrown backward onto the sofa, the newspaper still in his hands, his face largely destroyed. 2 more bullets hit him in the body, while the other rounds tore into the room, one striking Alan Smiley in the leg, another narrowly missing May Green. The assassin, or assassins, then vanished into the Beverly Hills night as silently as they had arrived, leaving behind only the smell of cordite, the glitter of broken glass, and the bloody aftermath of a prophecy fulfilled. The king of the desert vision had been dethroned not in his glittering palace, but in his own living room, his dream extinguished as abruptly and violently as a light switched off. The immediate aftermath of the gunshots was a vacuum of sound, a profound and terrifying silence that was quickly filled by the screams of May Green and the frantic, pained shouts of Alan Smiley, a chaos that erupted in the plush, blood-spattered living room, a stark and violent contrast to the serene affluence of North Linden Drive. Within minutes, the quiet Beverly Hills street was transformed into a scene of macabre spectacle, pulsating with the red and blue lights of police cars and an ambulance, their sirens wailing a dirge for the man who had so carefully cultivated an image of respectable luxury in this very neighborhood. The police officers who entered the house found a scene of almost theatrical horror. Benjamin Siegel lay supine on the elegant sofa, his body grotesquely contorted, one leg draped over a coffee table, the other on the floor. The force of the high-velocity rounds had been catastrophic. His right eye had been completely ejected from its socket and was later found 15 feet away across the room, a grisly testament to the sniper's precision and power. The official cause of death would be listed as cranial cerebral trauma, a cold, clinical term for the brutal obliteration that had been visited upon him. The investigation began with intense, feverish energy fueled by the notoriety of the victim. The Los Angeles Police Department, aware that they were dealing with the murder of a national celebrity of the underworld, scoured the scene for evidence. They found the 9 shell casings from the M1 carbine outside the window, but no usable fingerprints. They interviewed neighbors, some of whom reported seeing a shadowy figure or figures near the house, but no clear descriptions emerged. The murder weapon itself was never found, presumably dismantled and scattered across the vastness of the California landscape, a ghost that would never give up its secrets. The official investigation would eventually stall, hampered by the wall of silence known as Omert that protected the inner workings of the syndicate. No one was ever formally charged with the murder of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a fact that has fueled decades of speculation and conspiracy theories, but which, to those who understood the world he inhabited, was the most predictable outcome of all. It was a professional hit, clean, efficient, and utterly without recourse. The standard conclusion for those who failed the syndicate on such a grand scale. The news of his death spread like a wildfire across the nation, splashed across the front pages of newspapers from New York to Los Angeles. The narrative was irresistible. The handsome, charismatic gangster, the friend to movie stars, the man who dreamed of a desert paradise, gunned down in his mistress's Beverly Hills mansion. He was instantly immortalized, his life and death transformed into a cautionary tale and a source of public fascination that endures to this day. But while the public consumed the sensational details, the criminal underworld from which Siegel had sprung was conducting its own, far more pragmatic post-mortem. With the problem of Benjamin Siegel now permanently solved, the syndicate moved with cold, dispassionate speed to secure the asset that had cost them so much. Within hours of the murder, even as police were still marking evidence in the house on Linden Drive, Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum, the men Siegel had so despised arrived at the shuttered Flamingo in Las Vegas. They presented themselves to the staff and the few remaining loyalists not as usurpers, but as the new, legitimate management, there to stabilize the floundering enterprise on the direct orders of the owners back east. There was no resistance. The shadow of Siegel's violent death was a more persuasive argument than any he had ever made. Sedway and Greenbaum immediately implemented the kind of pragmatic, cost-conscious management that Siegel had found so abhorrent. They slashed the extravagant budgets, halted the non-essential luxury renovations, and focused on a single, simple goal: opening the casino and making it profitable. The dream of a self-contained resort paradise was scaled back into the reality of a functioning, money-making gambling hall. The reopening of the Flamingo, when it occurred, was a quiet, business-like affair, devoid of the Hollywood glitz and star-studded spectacle that Siegel had believed was essential. There was no Jimmy Durante, no Xavier Cugat, no convoy of limousines. They simply turned on the lights, opened the doors, and invited the public in. And something remarkable happened. Freed from the burden of Siegel's astronomical debt and his endless, expensive revisions, and under the steady, unglamorous management of the syndicate's accountants, the Flamingo began to make money. The public, curious about the infamous hotel and drawn by the notoriety of its founder's murder, came in droves. The casino tables were full, the hotel rooms were occupied, and for the first time, the cash flow was positive. The success was immediate and sustained. The Flamingo's profitability, achieved so quickly after Siegel's removal, was seen by the syndicate as the final, posthumous indictment of his management. It proved, in their eyes, that his vision was not the problem, his execution of it was. He had been right about the location and the concept, but his profligacy, his ego, and his refusal to be controlled had made him a fatal liability. The river of cash that now flowed from the desert did more than just enrich the mob. It illuminated the path forward. Other syndicate figures, seeing the success of the Flamingo under sober management, began to look at the dusty little town of Las Vegas with new, avaricious eyes. They saw that Siegel's core idea, a luxury resort catering to a national clientele, was not madness, but prophecy. The death of the dreamer had given birth to the industry. In the years that followed, one casino after another would rise along the highway leading away from downtown, a stretch of road that would become known as the Las Vegas Strip, each one grander than the last, each one funded with syndicate money and built on the blueprint, however refined, of the Flamingo, the Sahara, the Sands, the Riviera, the Stardust. They were all children of Siegel's original vision, though they bore the practical, profit-driven DNA of his killers. Benjamin Siegel had been the flawed, tragic architect, but it was the syndicate, the very force that murdered him, that would become the builder of his dream, erecting a glittering monument to greed and chance on the foundation of his ambition and his blood. The legacy of Benjamin Siegel is a complex and contradictory tapestry, woven with threads of brutal violence and breathtaking vision, a legacy that extends far beyond the bloody and on a Beverly Hills sofa and deep into the very soul of the modern city he helped conceive. In the years and decades following his death, the story of Bugsy Siegel was polished and romanticized, transformed from a sordid tale of gangland avarice into a foundational American myth, a narrative of the flawed visionary who saw the future in a barren wasteland and was destroyed by the small-minded men who could not comprehend his genius. This myth-making began almost immediately, fueled by the sensational press coverage of his murder and the subsequent rapid rise of Las Vegas, which seemed to validate his every prediction. The man who had been a problem to be eliminated by the syndicate was posthumously reborn as the founding father, a title that would have filled him with a profound sense of vindication. The true measure of his impact, however, lies not in the myth, but in the cold, hard reality of the city that grew from the seed he planted. The Flamingo, under the steady, profit-focused management of Sedway and Greenbaum, did not just succeed. It became a printing press for money, generating millions in clean, legal cash that flowed back to the crime families in New York, Chicago, and Miami, funding their further expansion into legitimate and illegitimate enterprises alike. This river of wealth demonstrated the incredible potential of Las Vegas as a machine for laundering vast sums of illicit capital and generating even vaster sums of taxable revenue. A dual-purpose engine that was perfectly suited to the needs of the mid-century American underworld. The success of the Flamingo was the clarion call, the undeniable proof of concept that unleashed a tidal wave of investment into the Nevada desert throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The Las Vegas Strip was transformed from a lonely highway with one prominent casino into a neon canyon of gambling palaces, each one attempting to outdo the last in size, luxury, and thematic extravagance. The Sahara, the Sands, the Riviera, the Tropicana, the Stardust. These were not independent ventures. They were outposts of various crime families, all built on the fundamental model Siegel had pioneered: a large, self-contained resort with a lavish casino, multiple restaurants, entertainment venues, and swimming pools, designed to keep tourists on the property and spending money for their entire stay. The syndicate had learned from Siegel's mistakes. They embraced his concept of luxury and scale, but imposed a strict, corporate discipline on spending and management, ensuring profitability from the very first day. They also perfected the art of the skim, a sophisticated system by which vast amounts of untaxed cash were secretly diverted from the counting rooms of the casinos before the official books were tallied. Money that was then delivered in suitcases to the crime bosses back east. Las Vegas became, in effect, the central bank of organized crime in America. And it was Benjamin Siegel's initial, flawed blueprint that had made it all possible. His personal dream of legitimacy and respectability, however, died with him. The city he envisioned became, for decades, an openly criminal enterprise, a place controlled by mobsters and run for their benefit, a fact that only added to its dangerous allure for a certain kind of tourist. The cultural imprint of his story is equally profound. He became an archetype, the gangster with a vision, a figure that has been endlessly portrayed in film, television, and literature, often stripped of his more monstrous qualities and reimagined as a tragic, romantic hero. Warren Beatty's iconic portrayal in the 1991 film Bugsy is perhaps the most famous example, cementing in the popular imagination the image of Siegel as a dreamer blinded by his own passion, a man whose greatest crime was loving a dream too much. This cinematic version softens the reality of the man who was a prolific and remorseless killer, a man whose temper was so volatile he once beat a man to death for allegedly stealing a few dollars from a slot machine, a man who was deeply enmeshed in the brutal machinery of murder incorporated. The myth conveniently separates the vision from the violence, allowing us to celebrate the creation without fully confronting the nature of the creator. Yet, to dismiss him as merely a lucky thug is to misunderstand history. The transformation of Las Vegas from a desert stopover into the global capital of entertainment is one of the most remarkable stories of the 20th century. And it is a story that is impossible to tell without assigning Benjamin Siegel a central, catalytic role. He was the spark. He possessed the unique combination of attributes required for such an insane undertaking. The audacity of a gangster who believed the normal rules did not apply to him. The connections to secure vast amounts of capital, however dangerous the terms, and the taste and ambition to imagine something that had never existed before. He was not a businessman. He was a fantasist, and it took a fantasist to see a city in the empty dust. The later corporate giants like Howard Hughes and Steve Wynn, who would eventually cleanse Vegas of its mob ties and transform it into a family, friendly and corporate, controlled destination. We're simply building upon the foundation that Siegel, with all his flaws and fury, had laid. They replaced the mob's skim with the corporation's stock offering. But the fundamental engine of the destination resort, the promise of an all-inclusive escape into a world of fantasy and chance, was his invention. His life stands as a permanent testament to the messy, often immoral, ways in which history is made, a reminder that profound change is not always ushered in by noble men, but sometimes by violent, ambitious, and deeply flawed individuals who are willing to stake everything, even their own lives, on a glimpse of a future that no one else can see. Benjamin Siegel's monument was not the Flamingo Hotel, which has been rebuilt and reimagined multiple times over the decades, but the entire glittering, chaotic, and endlessly fascinating city of Las Vegas itself, a city that remains, at its core, the ultimate expression of a gamble. The enduring mystery surrounding the assassination of Benjamin Siegel, a mystery officially unsolved but universally understood, forms a dark and intricate epilogue to his life, a labyrinth of speculation, accusation, and folklore that has only grown more complex with the passage of time. While the Los Angeles Police Department's investigation officially hit a dead end, the underworld and historians have long since reached a consensus on the broad strokes of the truth, pieced together from the accounts of informants, the logic of the syndicate's operations, and the tantalizing fragments of evidence that have surfaced over the decades. The who and the why are, in the general sense, clear. The order was given by the National Crime Syndicate, a collective decision ratified by its most powerful figures, including Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and Frank Costello, who saw Siegel's continued management of the Flamingo project as an existential threat to their financial stability and their organizational discipline. The $4 million he had spent, a sum equivalent to over $50 million today, was not just a loss, it was an act of defiance, a challenge to their authority that could not be allowed to stand, lest it encourage other underlings to believe they could operate with similar impunity. His death was a necessary corporate restructuring, a chilling message to the entire criminal world that no individual, no matter how charismatic or historically significant, was bigger than the organization. The more granular details of the assassination, however, the specific identities of the shooters, the precise planning of the operation, the role of his inner circle, remain the subject of intense and fascinating debate. The most widely accepted theory, supported by later FBI informants and the general consensus of organized crime historians, points directly to his childhood friend and the syndicate's chief financial mind, Meyer Lansky, as the man who, however reluctantly, gave the final order. Lansky, the ultimate pragmatist, is believed to have calculated that Siegel's demise was a business necessity, a heartbreaking but unavoidable sacrifice to protect the larger enterprise. The story, perhaps apocryphal, but perfectly capturing Lansky's character, is that when he was informed of Siegel's death, he simply said, "We only went up to 6 million. He cost us 6 million. He's gone." This cold, arithmetic eulogy encapsulates the professional reality of Siegel's execution. As for the physical perpetrators, the most credible evidence points to a team of killers, likely imported from the East Coast, to ensure there were no personal ties that could cause a hesitation at the critical moment. The use of an M1 carbine, a weapon not commonly used in American street crime, but readily available to veterans of World War II, suggests a professional with military training. For decades, suspicion has fallen on a man named Frankie Carbo, a known assassin and associate of murder, Incorporated, who was in Los Angeles at the time and had the requisite skills. Another theory implicates a team led by Samuel Mooney, Giancana of the Chicago outfit, which had a significant financial stake in the Flamingo and a reputation for efficient, long-distance hits. The logistics of the murder itself suggest inside knowledge or meticulous surveillance. The killer knew precisely which house was Virginia Hill's, which room Siegel would be in, and even the specific chair or sofa he preferred to sit in. This has led to persistent speculation about a setup from within Siegel's own circle. His friend Alan Smiley, who was sitting with him in the room and was only wounded in the leg, was naturally a suspect, though he was never charged and always maintained his innocence. Others have pointed to Virginia Hill herself, whose sudden departure for Europe just days before the hit has always been viewed as highly suspicious. Was she warned to leave, or was she an active participant in the plot? Perhaps as revenge for their tumultuous relationship, or to secure her own financial future with the money she had allegedly skimmed. The truth is likely a combination of these elements, a decision made at the highest levels of the syndicate, carried out by professional shooters from out of town, facilitated by intelligence possibly provided by those close to Siegel, and timed to coincide with Hill's departure to avoid complicating factors. The case was officially closed without any arrests, a testament to the impenetrable wall of silence that protected the guilty. In the years that followed, the Flamingo, now free of Siegel's extravagant spending, became a gold mine. Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum ran it with an iron fist, implementing the skim that funneled millions of untaxed dollars back to the syndicate bosses. The success of the Flamingo directly funded the construction of the next wave of casinos on the Strip, creating a feedback loop of investment and profit that built modern Las Vegas. Sedway and Greenbaum themselves did not live to old age. Greenbaum and his wife were brutally murdered in their Phoenix home in 1958, a hit believed to be connected to his own embezzlement from the Riviera Hotel, another grim reminder of the world Siegel had inhabited. Meyer Lansky, the architect of so much of the syndicate's financial empire, including its Vegas holdings, never achieved the legitimacy Siegel craved. He spent his later years fleeing from U.S. tax authorities and died in relative obscurity. Virginia Hill, after being hounded by congressional committees investigating organized crime, attempted suicide multiple times and eventually died of a drug overdose in Europe in 1966. The world that created and destroyed Benjamin Siegel was a brutal, self-consuming one, and few of its major players found peaceful ends. The city of Las Vegas, however, thrived, evolving beyond its mob roots into a corporate-owned global entertainment capital. But it never lost the foundational DNA implanted by Siegel, the idea that in the middle of a vast, empty desert, one could build a kingdom of fantasy, risk, and reward. His ghost is forever etched into its neon skyline, a permanent, spectral reminder of the violent and visionary birth of America's most improbable city. The cultural and historical digestion of Benjamin Siegel's life and legacy transformed him from a specific flawed individual into a powerful symbol, an icon whose story has been relentlessly mined for its dramatic potential and its profound insights into the dark underbelly of the American dream. In the decades following his death, the figure of Bugsy Siegel became unmoored from the gritty realities of his criminal career and was elevated into the realm of myth, a process that began with the sensational journalism of his own time and accelerated with each new retelling in film, television, and literature. This myth-making was not an accident. It served a purpose, both for the public, who craved a romanticized version of the gangster, and for the city of Las Vegas itself, which found in Siegel a convenient and charismatic founding father, a figure far more appealing than the faceless syndicate accountants who actually engineered its success. The first wave of this transformation occurred in the pulp novels and true crime magazines of the 1950s, which portrayed him as a tragic, almost Shakespearean figure, a man of immense potential brought down by a fatal flaw, in his case, an ambition that outstripped his discretion. These stories often downplayed his work as a primary enforcer for Murder, Incorporated, focusing instead on his Hollywood connections, his handsome features, and his doomed love affair with Virginia Hill by the 1967. As Las Vegas cemented its place in the American consciousness as the capital of sin and spectacle, Siegel's role as its visionary prophet became the dominant narrative. The city needed an origin story, and Siegel's tale of a man who saw a glorious city in an empty desert was perfectly suited for the task, a narrative that obscured the more sordid reality of mob money and violent coercion. This cultural repackaging reached its apotheosis with Warren Beatty's 1991 film Bugsy, a lavishly produced biopic that presented Siegel as a complex, charismatic, and ultimately sympathetic dreamer. The film, while acknowledging his violent tendencies, primarily frames him as an artiste manqué, a man whose vision for the Flamingo was a work of art, and whose murder was a tragic act of Philistine betrayal by his less imaginative partners. Beatty's portrayal, coupled with a stellar supporting cast, had a profound effect on the public's perception, solidifying the romanticized version of Siegel for a new generation. It emphasized his desire for legitimacy and his love for Hill, turning his life into a grand, operatic romance set against the backdrop of the emerging Las Vegas Strip. This cinematic treatment was, of course, a significant simplification. It glossed over the more brutal aspects of his character, such as the sheer number of his suspected murders and his legendary, terrifying temper, which could be triggered by the slightest perceived insult. The real Siegel was not just a dreamer. He was a stone-cold killer who personally executed associates and rivals. A man who once took a pleasure trip to Italy with the specific goal of meeting Benito Mussolini to propose a business partnership, and who was under surveillance by the FBI for his suspected role in a plot to sell stolen weapons to Nazi Germany. These darker, more complex facets of his life are often left out of the popular narratives, as they complicate the clean archetype of the tragic visionary. Beyond film, Siegel's influence permeates the very aesthetic of Las Vegas, and the broader culture's understanding of the gangster. He embodied a new kind of criminal, one who operated not in the shadows of back alleys, but in the blinding glare of Hollywood spotlights. A figure who understood the power of public relations and the importance of image. He was a precursor to the celebrity gangsters of the late 20th century, men who craved fame as much as they craved power. His specific dream, the self-contained, luxurious resort casino, became the template not only for Las Vegas, but for gambling hubs around the world, from Atlantic City to Macau. The concept of a destination where guests could sleep, eat, shop, see a show, and gamble without ever needing to step outside was his innovation, a revolutionary idea in hospitality that has been adopted by the global tourism industry. Furthermore, his story serves as a powerful and enduring cautionary tale about the nature of ambition and the price of dreaming too big. He is a classic example of the Icarus figure, a man who flew so close to the sun of his own ambition that his wings melted, sending him crashing back to earth. His life raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between crime and progress, between violence and innovation. Would Las Vegas have emerged as it did without the massive, illicit capital and the ruthless will of the mob? Was the violence and corruption a necessary evil in the birth of a world-changing city? There are no easy answers to these questions, but Siegel's life forces us to confront them. He remains a fixture in popular culture, referenced in countless songs, television shows, and video games. His name synonymous with a certain kind of stylish, ambitious gangsterism. His face, frozen in time from old newspaper photographs, remains strikingly handsome and compelling, an icon of a bygone era of American crime. The Flamingo Hotel, though now a corporatized, family-friendly resort owned by Caesars Entertainment, still pays homage to its notorious founder, with historical displays and his name subtly woven into its marketing, a testament to the enduring power of his story. Benjamin Siegel's ultimate legacy, therefore, is not just a city of neon and noise, but a permanent and complex symbol in the American imagination. A reminder that the line between visionary and criminal, between creator and destroyer, is often perilously thin, and that the most enduring American myths are often born from the most violent and morally ambiguous realities. Beneath the glamorous veneer of the Bugsy Siegel, myth lies a far darker and more psychologically complex reality, a portrait of a man driven by profound insecurities and a desperate, lifelong yearning for a legitimacy that perpetually eluded his grasp. To understand the ferocity of his ambition and the recklessness with which he pursued the flamingo, one must delve into the deep-seated wounds of his childhood and the formative experiences that shaped his character. Born into the squalor of the Williamsburg tenements, Siegel internalized a searing hatred for poverty and the powerlessness that accompanied it. The world of his youth was a brutal Darwinian arena where respect was not earned through polite accomplishment, but seized through force and cunning. This environment did not merely harden him. It instilled in him a core belief that the world was divided into predators and prey, and he was determined from his earliest days to be the most feared predator of all. His partnership with Meyer Lansky was founded on this principle, while Lansky was the cerebral strategist. The chess player who thought 10 moves ahead, Siegel was the embodiment of violent will, the enforcer who made abstract threats a terrifying reality. His work as a primary killer for the Bugs and Meyer mob, and later for Murder, Incorporated, was not just a job, it was an identity. It was the one arena in which he felt utterly powerful and in control, where his quick temper and capacity for brutality were not liabilities but supreme assets. However, this identity as a feared gangster existed in a state of constant tension with his aspirational self-image. As he accumulated wealth and power, he began to cultivate a persona of the sophisticated gentleman. He studied the manners and tastes of the upper class, investing heavily in his appearance, his homes, and his social connections. He didn't just want to be rich, he wanted to be respected, admired, and accepted by the very establishment his criminal activities undermined. This is why his friendship with George Raft and other Hollywood figures was so important to him. It represented a form of validation from a world that symbolized glamour and success. This desperate need for acceptance also explains his visceral hatred for the nickname Bugsy. To him, it was a constant, mocking reminder of his origins, a label that pinned him to the world of common, unrefined street thugs. He wanted to be Ben Siegel or Mr. Siegel, a businessman and a visionary, but the ghost of Bugsy, the crazy, violent kid from Brooklyn, was a shadow he could never escape. This internal conflict between the thug and the tycoon, between Bugsy and Benjamin, is the central drama of his life and the key to understanding his actions in Las Vegas. The Flamingo was not merely a business venture, it was his ultimate tool for self-transformation. It was going to be the project that would finally silence the whispers, that would prove to Meyer Lansky, to Hollywood, to the world, and most importantly to himself, that he was not just a gangster, but a builder, a creator, a legitimate captain of industry. This psychological need is what fueled his obsessive perfectionism and his refusal to compromise on even the most minor details. The Flamingo had to be perfect because he had to be perfect. Every piece of imported Italian marble, every Czechoslovakian crystal chandelier was not just a building material. It was a brick in the wall he was building between his past and his future, a tangible repudiation of the tenements of his youth. This is also why the syndicate's concerns about cost were so incomprehensible to him. In his mind, they were not just questioning his business acumen. They were questioning his very identity, his hard-won sense of self. Their demands for fiscal restraint felt like an attempt to force him back into the box of Bugsy, to treat him as a mere employee who had to answer to his superiors, rather than as the visionary master of his own destiny. His increasingly erratic and paranoid behavior in the final months, the rages on the construction site, the bearing of syndicate accountants, the public fights with Virginia Hill, were the actions of a man who could feel his meticulously constructed identity crumbling around him. The impending failure of the Flamingo threatened to expose him, not just as a failed businessman, but as a fraud, a street thug playing at being a gentleman, whose grand vision was nothing more than a costly delusion. This psychological torment made him impossible to reason with and ultimately sealed his fate. He was not killed simply for losing money. He was killed for refusing to acknowledge the authority of the syndicate, for believing that his personal vision and his quest for legitimacy placed him above the rules of the organization that had created him. In the end, the two halves of his identity proved irreconcilable. The killer he had been prevented the tycoon he longed to become from ever succeeding. The violence that had once been his source of power became the instrument of his destruction. His life stands as a stark tragedy of aspiration, a case study in how the very traits that enable a person to rise from nothing, the ruthlessness, the ambition, the refusal to accept limits, can become the fatal flaws that prevent them from ever truly arriving at their desired destination. Benjamin Siegel dreamed of building a monument that would forever erase his past, but he could never escape the shadow of the man he had to become to lay its first foundation. The figure of Virginia Hill weaves through the final years of Benjamin Siegel's life, not merely as a mistress or a companion, but as a pivotal and equally enigmatic force, a character whose own mysterious trajectory amplified the drama, financial intrigue, and ultimate tragedy of his story. To view Hill as simply the gangster's mole is to fundamentally misunderstand her role and her own formidable agency within the underworld ecosystem. She was a self-made woman of the criminal world, hailing from a poor background in Alabama, who had used her striking beauty, sharp intelligence, and unapologetic ambition to carve out a unique niche for herself as a confidante, courier, and lover to some of the most powerful mobsters in America, including Joe Adonis and, most significantly, Siegel himself. Her official role, as understood by law enforcement and the syndicate itself, was that of a bagwoman, a trusted operative who could transport large amounts of cash across state and national borders with a lower risk of suspicion than a known male gangster. This role gave her an intimate knowledge of the financial workings of the syndicate and made her a figure of both respect and suspicion. Her relationship with Siegel was a collision of two titanic personalities, both products of poverty, who had reinvented themselves through sheer force of will, both possessed of extravagant tastes and volatile tempers. They were, by all accounts, passionately in love, but theirs was a love affair conducted in a pressure cooker of ambition, paranoia, and unimaginable financial pressure. Hill was not a passive observer of Siegel's Flamingo dream. She was an active participant and an enthusiastic champion of his vision. She shared his taste for luxury and his desire for a life among the Hollywood elite, and she saw the Flamingo as their shared ticket to permanent legitimacy and social standing. She was often at his side in Las Vegas, offering opinions on decor and entertainment, fully embracing her role as the queen of his nascent desert kingdom. However, her presence and her activities also formed a central pillar of the case against Siegel in the eyes of the syndicate. Hill was known for her profligate spending, and Siegel financed it all, showering her with furs, jewelry, and a lavish lifestyle that raised eyebrows even among his wealthy criminal associates. The syndicate's accountants, already alarmed by the ballooning costs of the Flamingo, began to notice a disturbing correlation between the funds wired to Las Vegas and the large cash deposits Hill was making into her Swiss bank accounts. While it is possible that this was Siegel's method of securing funds for her, perhaps as a hedge against his own precarious position, the syndicate interpreted it as definitive proof that the two were systematically embezzling from the project. Every diamond bracelet she wore, every fur coat she purchased, was seen in New York and Chicago not as a gift from a lover, but as a direct theft from their investment. Hill's fiery personality and her perceived influence over Siegel also alienated the more traditional syndicate members, who viewed a woman's involvement in high-level financial matters with deep suspicion and contempt. As the pressure mounted in the final months, their relationship, once a partnership of ambition, began to fracture under the strain. The arguments became more frequent and more violent, witnessed by staff and associates. Hill, with her finely tuned survival instincts, began to sense the impending disaster long before Siegel was willing to fully acknowledge it. Her decision to leave for Europe in June of 1947, just days before the assassination, has been the subject of endless speculation. Was she warned by someone within the syndicate to get out of the way? Was she simply saving herself, cutting her losses and fleeing with the money she had accumulated? Or was her departure, as she later claimed to congressional investigators, unrelated to any knowledge of the plot? Whatever the truth, her timing was, from Siegel's perspective, a catastrophic betrayal. It left him isolated and emotionally adrift in his final days, and it provided the syndicate with the final piece of circumstantial evidence they needed to confirm their theories of theft and treachery. After Siegel's murder, Hill's life spiraled into a prolonged and public downward trajectory. She became a central witness in the Kefauver Committee hearings on organized crime in 1950-51, where her defiant, often combative testimony made her a national celebrity. She famously clashed with senators, refusing to be intimidated and openly mocking their lines of questioning. While she provided little concrete information that led to prosecutions, her testimony offered the public a tantalizing glimpse into the hidden world of the mob and cemented her image as the quintessential gangster's mole. But the notoriety took its toll. Hounded by the press and by law enforcement, she struggled with depression and alcoholism. She eventually exiled herself to Europe, moving between Switzerland and Austria, her life a sad echo of the glamour she had once known. On March 24, 1966, she was found dead on a snowy hillside near Salzburg, Austria, the result of an overdose of barbiturates. Her death was officially ruled a suicide, a lonely and bitter end for the woman who had once stood at the right hand of the man who dreamed of Las Vegas. The relationship between Siegel and Hill was a perfect, destructive symbiosis. He provided the power and the grand vision. She provided the style, the ferocity, and a conduit to the secret financial channels of the underworld. Together, they embodied the intoxicating and dangerous allure of the criminal life at its peak. The money, the glamour, the belief that they were above the law and beyond the reach of consequence. But in the end, they were also consumed by the very world they sought to master. Hill was not the cause of Siegel's downfall, but she was an accelerant, a complicating factor who deepened the syndicate's distrust and whose actions in the final act provided a compelling narrative of betrayal that justified, in their minds, the ultimate punishment. Their story remains one of the great, tragic romances of the American underworld, a partnership of two flawed and powerful people who reached for a kingdom and found only dust and blood. The physical and symbolic heart of Benjamin Siegel's entire saga, the Flamingo Hotel and Casino, possesses its own life story, a narrative arc that extends far beyond the violent death of its creator and reflects the broader evolution of Las Vegas itself from a mob-dominated playground to a corporatized global entertainment capital. After Siegel's assassination and the subsequent takeover by Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum, the Flamingo underwent a rapid and profound transformation in both its physical presence and its operational philosophy. The new management, acting on the direct orders of the syndicate back east, immediately set about purging the project of what they saw as Siegel's wasteful extravagances. The grand, unfinished visions, the sprawling tropical gardens, the Olympic pool complex, the private airstrip, were either scaled back dramatically or abandoned entirely. The focus shifted from creating a work of art to operating an efficient, profit-generating machine. The casino floor, once envisioned as a cathedral of high-stakes gambling for the elite, was reconfigured to maximize the number of tables and slot machines, catering to a broader, more middle-class clientele. The hotel rooms were completed with standard, functional furnishings rather than the custom-made pieces Siegel had commissioned. This ruthless pragmatism achieved exactly what the syndicate had hoped for. Within a year of its opening under their control, the Flamingo was generating a substantial profit, finally validating the location and the core concept, if not the method, of Siegel's original vision. The success of the Flamingo under this new, austere management became the undeniable proof of concept that triggered the great casino building boom on the Las Vegas Strip throughout the 1950s. The Desert Inn, the Sahara, the Sands, and the Riviera all rose in quick succession, each one funded by different crime families, but all following the basic model Siegel had pioneered: a large, themed resort with a casino, multiple restaurants, a swimming pool, and a showroom featuring big-name entertainment. The Flamingo itself continued to evolve, undergoing several expansions and renovations over the next 2 decades, each one adding more rooms, a larger casino, and more elaborate signage, slowly growing into the behemoth that Siegel had imagined, but now fueled by the steady, reliable skim of cash that flowed back to the mob. The hotel changed hands several times within the underworld, a valuable chip in the constant power struggles of organized crime. The original syndicate management gave way to control by the Chicago outfit, and later, for a time, it was run by Morris Mo Dalitz, a key figure from the Cleveland crime family. Throughout this period, the Flamingo, like the city itself, was a glamorous front for a vast criminal enterprise, a place where entertainers like Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack performed for audiences that included the very mobsters who owned the stages they sang on. The beginning of the end for this era came in the late 1960s, catalyzed by Howard Hughes's purchase of several strip properties, and more significantly, by the corporate takeover of the Flamingo itself. In 1967, the hotel was sold to a group that included the eccentric billionaire Kirk Kerkorian, who began the process of legitimizing its ownership. This transition from mob to corporate control was not always smooth. The hidden ownership interests and the entrenched systems of the skim were difficult to completely eradicate, but the tide was turning. The passage of the Corporate Gaming Act in 1969 by the Nevada legislature was a watershed moment, allowing publicly traded corporations to own casinos without the need for every individual stockholder to be licensed by the state. This opened the floodgates for Wall Street investment and marked the definitive end of the mob's monopoly on Las Vegas. The Flamingo, once the symbol of gangster ambition, became just another asset on a corporate balance sheet. It was acquired by the Hilton Hotels Corporation in 1970 and later became a cornerstone of Caesars Entertainment, one of the world's largest gaming corporations. Throughout the 1980s, 90s, and into the 21st century, the Flamingo has been continuously renovated, expanded, and rebranded to compete in the new Las Vegas, a city now defined by themed mega resorts like the Mirage, the Luxor, and the Bellagio. The original U-shaped building that Siegel knew is long gone, replaced by towering hotel wings that dwarf the initial structure. The casino floor is a vast, sprawling space filled with thousands of slot machines and hundreds of tables, a far cry from the intimate, opulent room he had designed. The lush gardens he envisioned have been realized in the form of the Flamingo wildlife habitat, a 15-acre oasis with flamingos, swans, and koi, a nod to the original theme that now serves as a family-friendly attraction. The hotel's history is marketed as a charming anecdote, a piece of nostalgic lore about the gangster who built Las Vegas, with historical photos and plaques discreetly placed for tourists to discover. The brutal reality of its origins, the murder, the embezzlement, the violent takeover, has been sanitized and packaged as part of the city's colorful mythology. The Flamingo today is a successful, profitable, and utterly conventional corporate enterprise, a testament to the fact that Siegel's vision was ultimately correct, even if he was the wrong man to execute it. The hotel's journey from a mobster's dream to a corporate giant mirrors the journey of Las Vegas itself, a transition from a lawless frontier town controlled by criminal syndicates to a regulated, corporatized global destination. Benjamin Siegel's monument still stands, but it has been rebuilt so many times, both physically and philosophically, that it is now a monument not to a man, but to an industry that he, more than any other single individual, willed into existence on a barren stretch of desert highway. The city of Las Vegas, as it exists today, is a living, breathing monument to Benjamin Siegel's vision, but it is a monument that has been so thoroughly sanitized, corporatized, and expanded upon that its founding father would likely find it both unrecognizable and the ultimate vindication of his tortured dreams. To walk the modern strip is to experience a physical manifestation of Siegel's core idea, that a self-contained world of fantasy, risk, and luxury could be created in the middle of a barren desert, but executed on a scale that would have dwarfed even his most grandiose imaginings. The journey from the Flamingo of 1947 to the Las Vegas of the 21st century is a story of relentless growth, reinvention, and the gradual, though never complete, erasure of its criminal origins. In the decades immediately following Siegel's death, the city grew at a ferocious pace, but it remained firmly under the control of various organized crime families. The 1950s and 60s were the golden age of the mob in Vegas, a period romanticized in films like Casino, when casinos like the Sands, the Desert Inn, and the Stardust were owned by shadowy syndicates and run by men with nicknames like Mo, Lefty, and Trigger. The money was astronomical, and the skim was the central financial engine, a system so efficient and brazen that it funded criminal operations across the United States. This era was defined by a unique blend of raw criminal power and public glamour, where the world's biggest stars performed for audiences of gangsters and high rollers, all operating under a fragile truce with corrupt local politicians and law enforcement. However, this arrangement could not last forever. The turning point began in the late 1960s, spurred by two key events: the arrival of Howard Hughes and the passage of the Corporate Gaming Act. Hughes, the reclusive billionaire, checked into the Desert Inn in 1966 and ended up buying it, along with several other major properties, not out of a desire to gamble, but to create a business empire free from government interference. His massive, legitimate financial investments signaled to Wall Street that Las Vegas was a viable market, and his very presence began to push the mob to the margins. The Corporate Gaming Act of 1969 was the death knell for mob control, as it allowed publicly traded corporations to own casinos, opening the door for massive investment from hotel chains and other corporate entities that had the capital to build on a scale the mob could never match. The 1970s and 80s saw a slow but steady corporate takeover, a process often punctuated by violence as the old guard resisted its inevitable demise. The era of the mega resort began in 1989 with Steve Wynn's opening of the Mirage, a $630 million hotel that was not funded by the Teamsters pension fund or mob cash, but by Wall Street junk bonds. The Mirage was a revolution. It wasn't just a casino with a hotel attached. It was a full-scale, themed destination with a volcano, a dolphin habitat, and a Siegfried and Roy magic show. Its phenomenal success proved that the future of Las Vegas lay in attracting a mass market of tourists and families, not just hardcore gamblers. This triggered an arms race of development that transformed the skyline. The 1990s and early 2000s saw the rise of ever larger and more fantastical resorts, the Pyramid of the Luxor, the New York skyline, the Venetian's canals, and the Bellagio's fountains. These were no longer merely casinos. They were immersive entertainment experiences, city-states dedicated to consumption in all its forms. The corporate ownership, MGM Resorts, Caesars Entertainment, Wynn Resorts, brought a level of professional management, marketing sophistication, and global branding that the mob could never have conceived of. The city actively rebranded itself from Sin City to a family destination, and then to the entertainment capital of the world, a place for conventions, world-class dining, and spectacular shows. The old gritty, mob-run Vegas was systematically bulldozed to make way for this new, gleaming version. The Sands, the Stardust, the Desert Inn, all were imploded in spectacular fashion, their dust clouds symbolically burying the past. Through all of this, the ghost of Bugsy Siegel has been a persistent, if often sanitized, presence. The Flamingo, now a bustling, pink-hued centerpiece of the Caesars empire, pays homage to its founder with a certain winking nostalgia. His story is told in museum exhibits and coffee table books. The sharp edges of his violence and the grim reality of his murder smoothed over into a tale of a colorful character from the city's wild past. He has been fully absorbed into the city's official mythology. A useful and charismatic founding father whose criminality is treated as a charming quirk rather than a defining characteristic. The modern Las Vegas is the ultimate fulfillment of his prophecy, a city that exists for no reason other than entertainment and the pursuit of fortune. But it is a fulfillment that has transcended its creator. The corporate executives who now run the city are the legitimate businessmen Siegel always pretended to be. The billions of dollars in revenue are counted by accountants and reported to shareholders, not skimmed into suitcases. The violence is now confined to action movies on giant IMAX screens. Benjamin Siegel's dream was realized, but in the process, his city outgrew him, becoming something far larger, more complex, and more powerful than the solitary, haunted man who first dared to imagine it rising from the dust. To truly comprehend the monumental scale of Benjamin Siegel's gamble and the subsequent financial catastrophe that led to his death, one must descend from the realm of grand narrative into the stark, unforgiving language of accounting, a world of numbers that tells a story of ambition unmoored from reality. The financial trajectory of the Flamingo project is not merely a backdrop to Siegel's story. It is the central, driving plot, a ticking clock that measured the remaining seconds of his life. The initial budget presented to the syndicate was a work of profound, and perhaps deliberate, underestimation, a figure believed to be around $1 million, a sum already substantial for a hotel casino in 1945. This number, however, was almost immediately rendered obsolete by the sheer force of Siegel's vision and his obsessive perfectionism. The costs began to spiral from the very first day of construction, accelerating at a pace that terrified the more pragmatic minds in the syndicate. The choice of location itself, several miles outside the established downtown core, added immense initial costs for infrastructure, paving new roads, extending water and power lines across miles of empty desert, a burden that a downtown project would not have faced. Then came the materials. Siegel's demand for only the finest, most luxurious imports meant that the construction site became a museum of global sourcing, with marble from Italy, timber from rare hardwoods, custom designed furniture from the most expensive workshops in Los Angeles and New York, and crystal chandeliers commissioned from European artisans. The cost of acquiring these materials was staggering, but the cost of transporting them to a remote Nevada construction site was often even more exorbitant. Delays in shipping led to work stoppages, which in turn led to cost overruns in labor, as crews had to be paid to wait or be reassigned and then recalled. Siegel's management style, a volatile combination of micro management and grandiose last-minute design changes, created a constant state of chaos on the site. He would order walls torn down and rebuilt because he didn't like the sight lines, demand changes to the plumbing or electrical systems after they had been installed, and insist on landscaping that involved the transplantation of full-grown palm trees at an astronomical cost per tree. The original architect, George Vernon Russell, was eventually fired for failing to keep up with Siegel's ever-evolving and increasingly expensive demands. The labor costs were another black hole. To meet his impossible deadlines, Siegel insisted on multiple shifts working around the clock, requiring overtime pay that doubled and tripled the standard labor expenses. There were also persistent, though unproven, rumors that Siegel was being systematically overcharged by suppliers and contractors who knew the project was backed by bottomless and anonymous mob money. A classic case of what would later be termed the black hole effect in construction fraud. By the time the Flamingo was ready for its disastrous soft opening in December 1946, the total cost had ballooned to an estimated $4 to $6 million, a figure so vast it was difficult to comprehend. To put this in a modern perspective, adjusting for inflation, $6 million in 1947 is equivalent to over $80 million today. But the financial bleeding did not stop with the construction. The operating costs of the half-finished hotel were themselves ruinous. The payroll for the large staff of dealers, cooks, waiters, bellhops, and entertainers was immense. The contracts for headliners like Jimmy Durante and Xavier Cugat for the opening were for tens of thousands of dollars, a fortune at the time. The utilities for cooling the vast, glass-walled building in the desert heat and powering its thousands of lights were a constant drain, and all of this expenditure was set against a revenue stream that was initially non-existent. The syndicate's money was not a gift, it was an investment, and one that came with the highest possible interest rate. The expectation of prompt and substantial returns. As the financial reports, or the lack thereof, trickled back to New York and Chicago, the mood turned from concern to fury. The syndicate bosses were not venture capitalists. They were criminals who understood cash flow and profit margins with the clarity of men whose lives depended on it. The concept of burn rate was as real to them as it is to a modern Silicon Valley investor, but with far deadlier consequences for those who exceeded it. They began to see the Flamingo not as a potential gold mine, but as a bottomless pit into which their hard-earned capital was being poured with nothing to show for it. The suspicion of embezzlement, whether by Siegel alone or in concert with Virginia Hill, became a logical conclusion for men who could not otherwise explain such flagrant financial mismanagement. The final, fatal financial blow was the decision to close the hotel after the failed opening. This act meant that the massive debt would continue to accrue interest and obligations with zero revenue to offset it. A scenario that in the corporate world leads to bankruptcy, but in the underworld leads to a death sentence. The $6 million figure, whether entirely accurate or not, became the symbolic value of Siegel's life in the ledgers of the syndicate. It was the number that tipped the scales, the quantifiable measure of his failure. The financial story of the Flamingo is the ultimate cautionary tale of a capital-intensive project without disciplined fiscal controls. A lesson in how a grand vision, when divorced from financial reality, can become a weapon that destroys its creator. Siegel bet that his vision was so powerful it could rewrite the rules of economics. The syndicate, in the most final way possible, proved him wrong. The world that created Benjamin Siegel and then ruthlessly eliminated him was not a disorganized collection of thugs, but a highly sophisticated, nation-wide criminal consortium that functioned with the cold efficiency of a major corporation. A shadowy entity that historians and law enforcement would later dub the National Crime Syndicate. To understand the true gravity of Siegel's transgression, one must first appreciate the power, structure, and ethos of this organization, which represented a quantum leap in the professionalization of American crime. Its origins lay in the violent territorial wars of the Prohibition era, a period that demonstrated to savvy criminals like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Siegel himself that endless conflict was bad for business. The solution, masterminded largely by Luciano and Lansky, was to create a board of directors for the underworld, a commission that would allocate territories, settle disputes, and authorize murders, thereby ensuring a stable and profitable environment for all its members. This syndicate, formalized in the mid-1930s, was a partnership of the most powerful crime families from across the United States, including those from New York, Chicago, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. It was a revolutionary concept, crime as a cartel. Its operations were vast and diversified, encompassing labor racketeering, loan sharking, narcotics, and most importantly for Siegel's story, illegal gambling, which was the single largest source of revenue for the organization. The race wire service, which Siegel had been sent to California to control, was the syndicate's nervous system, a nationwide telegraph network that delivered up to the minute odds and results from racetracks to illegal betting parlors in every major city. Control of this wire was control of the lifeblood of illegal gambling, and Siegel's success in wresting it from rivals was a key achievement that cemented his value to the organization. The syndicate operated on a strict code of conduct, an unwritten constitution that emphasized loyalty, discretion, and, above all, financial accountability. Members were expected to kick a significant portion of their earnings up the chain of command and to provide a clear and compelling return on any investment the syndicate made in their ventures. It was within this rigid, corporate-like structure that Siegel's Flamingo project was conceived. Initially, the syndicate saw it as a brilliant opportunity, a way to launder their immense profits from illegal activities through a legitimate, cash-based business in a state where gambling was legal. It was the perfect front. But from the syndicate's perspective, Siegel violated every core tenet of their code. His refusal to adhere to a budget was a direct challenge to their financial authority. His secretive nature and his barring of their accountants from the books were acts of profound insubordination and a breach of trust. His very public, Hollywood-centric lifestyle violated their principle of discretion, drawing unwanted attention from the press and law enforcement. Most egregiously, his perceived embezzlement, whether real or simply the result of catastrophic mismanagement, was the ultimate sin theft from the family. In the legitimate business world, a CEO who overspent a budget by 600% would be fired by the board of directors. In the syndicate, the penalty for such a failure was execution. The decision to kill Benjamin Siegel was therefore not a crime of passion, but a calculated corporate decision made by the executive committee to protect the health of the larger enterprise. He was not murdered because he was a dreamer. He was murdered because he was a disastrous manager who had become a liability. His death was a necessary piece of risk management, a public demonstration that no one was above the syndicate's laws. The chilling efficiency with which the hit was carried out by out-of-town shooters using a military-grade rifle, followed by the immediate and seamless takeover of the Flamingo by syndicate appointees, was a testament to the organization's reach and operational discipline. It sent a clear message to every other crime boss in the country. The syndicate's authority was absolute, and its justice was swift and final. The men who ordered his death, like Lansky and Luciano, did not see themselves as murderers in this instance, but as executives liquidating a toxic asset. They had a multi-million-dollar business to run, and Siegel had become a rogue division manager who was threatening to bankrupt the entire corporation. His story, when viewed through this lens, is not just a biography of a gangster, but a case study in the internal governance of organized crime, a stark illustration of how the very system that enabled his rise could also mandate his destruction when his personal ambitions conflicted with the collective good of the organization. Benjamin Siegel dared to dream a dream that was too big for the syndicate to contain, and in the end, the corporation, as it always must, consumed the individual. The character of Meyer Lansky stands in stark, contrasting relief to that of Benjamin Siegel, representing the other pole of the criminal psyche. The cold, calculating, and enduring strategist versus the fiery, impulsive, and self-destructive visionary. Their relationship, one of the most significant and tragic partnerships in the annals of American crime, forms the emotional and operational backbone of Siegel's rise and fall. A bond of brotherhood that ultimately could not survive the ruthless arithmetic of the syndicate's balance sheet. They had met as teenagers on the mean streets of Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Two ambitious boys from impoverished Jewish backgrounds who recognized in each other a complementary set of skills and a shared hunger for a world beyond the tenements. Lansky was the brains, a mathematical genius with a cool, analytical mind that could devise complex business schemes and long-term strategic plans. Siegel was the brawn and the charisma, the fearless enforcer whose terrifying volatility and willingness to use extreme violence made their partnership a formidable force. Together, they formed the Bugs and Meyer mob, which evolved from a small, time street gang into a sophisticated operation specializing in car thefts for bootleggers, and, most notably, contract killings. They were the original odd couple of organized crime. Lansky, small, quiet, and unassuming, who preferred to operate from the shadows, and Siegel, tall, handsome, and flamboyant, who craved the spotlight. This partnership was the foundation upon which their later power within the national crime syndicate was built. They were inseparable, with a loyalty that was legendary in the underworld. It was said that a threat to one was a threat to both, and the response would be swift and merciless. When the syndicate decided to expand its operations to the West Coast, it was this trusted partnership that was dispatched. With Siegel as the charismatic frontman in Los Angeles and Lansky as the financial mastermind back east, overseeing the books and maintaining the crucial connections to the other crime families. For years, this arrangement worked flawlessly. Siegel's success in taking over the race wire and establishing offshore gambling operations generated significant revenue, and Lansky ensured that the profits were properly allocated and that the syndicate's investors were kept happy. The Flamingo project, however, was the crack that would eventually shatter this decades-long bond. Initially, Lansky was likely a supporter of the idea, seeing its potential for money laundering and legitimate profit. He used his considerable influence to secure the initial funding from the syndicate, vouching for his old friend. But as the costs began to spiral out of control, Lansky found himself in an increasingly impossible position. As the syndicate's chief financial officer, he was responsible for justifying the ever-increasing cash flows to powerful, impatient, and dangerous men like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello. He sent repeated warnings to Siegel, urging fiscal restraint, but these pleas were met with anger and accusations of betrayal. Siegel saw Lansky's pragmatism as a lack of faith, a failure to believe in the dream. For Lansky, it was a simple matter of numbers, and the numbers were catastrophic. The friendship, once their greatest strength, had become a liability for Lansky. His own position and reputation within the syndicate were now tied to Siegel's failure. To continue defending Siegel was to risk being seen as complicit in the embezzlement, or at best, incompetent in his oversight. The final, heartbreaking rupture came when the collective decision was made to eliminate Siegel. While no historical evidence explicitly places the order in Lansky's mouth, his position as the syndicate's financial conscience and his relationship with Siegel made his acquiescence, if not his active approval, a mathematical certainty. To vote against it would have been to declare himself an enemy of the syndicate. The story of his cold eulogy, "We only went up to 6 million. He cost us 6 million. He's gone," whether apocryphal or not, perfectly captures the painful transition from friend to executive. The man had been subsumed by the organization. In the aftermath, Lansky did what he always did. He managed the situation for maximum profit. He ensured a smooth transition of the Flamingo to new management and oversaw the skim that finally made the hotel the financial engine it was always meant to be. He lived a long life, constantly pursued by law enforcement, but never serving significant prison time, a testament to his intelligence and caution. He died in 1983, a forgotten figure in many ways, especially when compared to the legendary status of his murdered friend. The tragedy of their relationship is a classic one, the story of the brain and the heart being torn asunder. Lansky was the mind that could calculate every move, but perhaps failed to account for the cost to his own soul. Siegel was the heart, all passion and impulse, who felt betrayed by the very logic that had once protected him. They were two halves of a whole that, for a time, conquered the American underworld, but in the end, the disciplined, corporate logic of the syndicate, a system they had both helped to build, could not accommodate the messy, expensive, and glorious dream of one of its founders. Lansky survived because he understood that the business was everything. Siegel died because he believed, until the very end, that he was above it. The immediate and long-term repercussions of Benjamin Siegel's assassination sent shockwaves through the American underworld, recalibrating power dynamics, reinforcing the syndicate's absolute authority, and permanently altering the trajectory of organized crime's relationship with Las Vegas. In the short term, the message was received loud and clear by every crime figure in the nation. No one was untouchable. The murder of a man of Siegel's stature, a founding member of the syndicate and a personal friend of its most powerful leaders, was a demonstration of power so stark that it brooked no argument. It silenced any potential dissent and solidified the principle that the organization was supreme to any individual within it. For the syndicate bosses in New York, Chicago, and Miami, it was a successful, if brutal, piece of corporate housekeeping. The removal of Siegel allowed them to install their own loyal, pragmatic managers at the Flamingo, men like Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum, who understood that their primary duty was not to a visionary dream, but to the steady, reliable flow of cash into the syndicate's coffers. The subsequent profitability of the Flamingo under this new management was seen as vindication of their decision, proof that Siegel had been the obstacle, not the asset. This success, in turn, unleashed a flood of syndicate investment into Las Vegas. Confident that they now had a proven model and a management structure that would obey orders, the various crime families began to pour money into building their own casinos along the Strip. The late 1940s and the entire decade of the 1950s became the golden age of mob control in Las Vegas, a period where the city, was essentially a colony of the National Crime Syndicate. The Sands was built with money from the Genovese and Siegel's old partner, Meyer Lansky. The Desert Inn was a project of the Cleveland mob and later became a key asset for Mo Delitz. The Riviera was funded by the Chicago outfit. Each of these casinos became a private fiefdom for a different crime family, but all operated under the overarching authority of the Syndicates Commission, which settled disputes and ensured that the scheme operated smoothly for everyone's benefit. The Siegel hit had, paradoxically, created the stability and confidence necessary for the mob to build its greatest empire. The long-term repercussions, however, contained the seeds of the syndicate's eventual downfall in Vegas. The very success of the Flamingo and its successors drew an immense amount of legal and political scrutiny. The sheer volume of money flowing through the casinos and the obvious presence of known gangsters could not be ignored forever. The Kefauver Committee hearings of 1950-51, which investigated organized crime on a national scale, put Las Vegas and its mob connections squarely in the public eye. Virginia Hill's testimony, in particular, shone a spotlight on the financial machinations behind the Flamingo and the role of Siegel's murder in transferring its control. While the hearings did not lead to immediate prosecutions, they began the process of eroding the mob's veil of secrecy and building public pressure for a crackdown. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, who had long been reluctant to acknowledge the existence of a national crime syndicate, was forced to begin more serious investigations. The Siegel murder itself remained an open wound, a symbol of the mob's power and a constant reminder to law enforcement of their failure to achieve justice. Furthermore, the corporate model the syndicate had imposed on Las Vegas after Siegel's death would, decades later, be its undoing. By proving that a casino resort could be a fantastically profitable enterprise, the mob inadvertently created a template that legitimate corporations, with access to far greater capital through Wall Street, would eventually adopt. The Corporate Gaming Act of 1969 was the direct result of the demonstrated profitability of the mob's model. The corporations that moved in, like Hilton and later MGM and Caesars, simply replicated the resort concept on a grander scale, but with clean money and professional management that could not be easily corrupted or intimidated. The mob was eventually squeezed out, not by police raids, but by market forces it had helped to create. The assassination of Benjamin Siegel, therefore, stands as a pivotal hinge in the history of American organized crime. In the short term, it was a masterstroke that consolidated the syndicate's power and unlocked the vast potential of Las Vegas. It demonstrated a chilling efficiency and a ruthless commitment to its own survival. But in the long term, it set in motion a chain of events, increased scrutiny, a proven business model for corporate takeover, and the creation of a legendary founding myth for the city that would ultimately lead to the mob's expulsion from the paradise it had built. Siegel's death ensured the success of his dream, but it also ensured that the dream would eventually outgrow and exclude the very men who had killed him to claim it. The enduring fascination with Benjamin, Bugsy, Siegel, a figure who has been dead for over 3/4 of a century, speaks to something deep within the American psyche, a collective captivation with the archetype of the gangster as a tragic, ambitious, and uniquely American anti-hero. His story resonates because it is not merely a chronicle of crime, but a classic tale of hubris, ambition, and the perilous pursuit of the American dream through the only means available to those born outside the system. Siegel's narrative is a dark reflection of the Horatio Alger myth. He did pull himself up by his bootstraps, but he used murder and extortion as his ladder. He achieved immense wealth and power. But it was the wealth and power of the underworld, a gilded cage that ultimately confined and destroyed him. He yearned for legitimacy and respectability, the core desires of the American immigrant experience, but the path he chose made that goal forever unattainable. This internal conflict, this desperate struggle to transcend his own origins, makes him a profoundly compelling and human figure, far more so than a purely evil villain or a one-dimensional thug. He is Icarus with a Tommy gun, a man whose greatest strength, his boundless, audacious ambition, was also his fatal flaw. This archetype has been a staple of American cinema since its inception, from the classic gangster films of the 1930s, like The Public Enemy to Scarface, and Siegel's life fits this mold perfectly. He is the handsome, charismatic outsider who challenges the established order, lives by his own code, and meets a violent, poetic end. Warren Beatty's portrayal in the 1991 film Bugsy solidified this romantic interpretation for a modern audience, emphasizing his visionary qualities and his passionate love affair, while softening the more brutal edges of his character. The film, like much of the popular culture that surrounds him, focuses on the creator, the dreamer, the man who saw a city in the desert, and in doing so, it performs a kind of moral alchemy, transforming a ruthless killer into a tragic artist. This process is essential to the myth. It allows us to celebrate the creation of Las Vegas without having to fully confront the monstrous nature of its creator. We are fascinated by the contradiction. The man who could calmly order a murder could also be moved to tears by the beauty of a piece of fabric for his hotel's curtains. The man who socialized with movie stars was the same man who had once been a street urchin rolling drunks. This duality is the source of his enduring power as a cultural icon. Furthermore, his story taps into a deep, ambivalent relationship America has with its own success. The building of the country, and particularly the West, has always been fraught with violence, corruption, and the displacement of the weak by the strong. The history of American capitalism is filled with robber barons who operated in legal gray areas, using ruthless tactics to build empires. Siegel is a grotesque, exaggerated mirror of this tradition. He was a robber baron of the underworld, using muscle instead of monopolies, but the driving force was the same, an insatiable ambition to build something monumental, regardless of the cost. Las Vegas itself is the ultimate symbol of this. A city built on water stolen from other states, funded by money stolen from the public, and conceived by a man who stole lives. We are both repelled, and attracted by this origin story because it forces us to question the sanitized versions of our history. The clean, corporate Las Vegas of today is built upon a foundation of sand and blood, and Siegel is the ghost that reminds us of that uncomfortable truth. His continued presence in books, documentaries, and films is a testament to our need to periodically revisit this dark well, to examine the complex, often immoral, forces that shape our world. He represents the seductive and dangerous idea that rules are for other people, that vision trumps morality, and that a single individual, through sheer force of will, can bend reality to their desire. It is a powerful, intoxicating fantasy, and Siegel lived it to its absolute, logical, and bloody conclusion. His life is a permanent part of the American mythology, a cautionary tale about the price of dreams, and a dark mirror held up to our own national obsession with wealth, fame, and reinvention. He is a reminder that the line between a visionary and a criminal is often just a matter of perspective and opportunity, and that the most enduring American legends are often written not in ink, but in blood. And so we arrive at the end of our journey. A journey that began in the squalid tenements of Brooklyn and concluded in a burst of gunfire in a Beverly Hills living room. A journey that traced the arc of a man who dared to envision a glittering metropolis in the heart of an empty desert. The story of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel is ultimately a story about the power of an idea so potent that it could survive the catastrophic failure, the violent death, and the profound moral corruption of its originator. He was not a good man. He was a killer, a thief, and a brutal enforcer who lived by the sword and predictably died by it. But he was also a seer, a man whose vision for Las Vegas was so clear and so compelling that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy, a gravitational force that pulled the future toward it. The city that stands today, with its towering temples of glass and steel, its spectacular fountains, and recreated global landmarks, is the physical manifestation of that vision, albeit on a scale he could never have imagined. It is his true, lasting monument, far more enduring than any single building. The Flamingo he knew is gone, replaced and rebuilt, but the concept it introduced, the self-contained, luxurious resort casino as a destination for the world, remains the foundational DNA of the entire Las Vegas Strip every time a new mega resort opens. Every time a tourist arrives with a sense of wonder at the sheer audacity of the city, they are participating in the legacy of Bugsy Siegel. His life forces us to confront a difficult and uncomfortable question. Can a beautiful, world-changing thing be born from ugliness and sin? Can a visionary be a monster? The answer, as his story so vividly illustrates, is a resounding yes. The history of human progress is not a clean, linear narrative of noble inventors and benevolent leaders. It is often a messy, bloody, and morally ambiguous affair driven by flawed, complex, and frequently terrible individuals whose ambitions, for better or worse, reshape the world. Siegel's dream was built with mob money, constructed by men who lived by violence, and realized through a system of institutionalized theft known as the skim. The early glamour of Las Vegas was underwritten by murder, extortion, and corruption. To ignore this is to misunderstand the city's true nature and the complex forces that forge history. Siegel's story is a permanent reminder that creation and destruction are often two sides of the same coin, wielded by the same hand. As we bring this narrative to a close, we must reflect on the man himself, a bundle of furious contradictions. He was both the sophisticated Hollywood socialite and the street brawler from Brooklyn, the loving father who sent his daughters to the best schools, and the cold, blooded killer who executed rivals without a second thought. The visionary who dreamed of a glorious city, and the reckless spendthrift who nearly bankrupted the project before it could open. He was all of these things simultaneously, and it is this very complexity that makes him so endlessly fascinating. He cannot be easily categorized or dismissed. He was a human being of immense drive and profound failing, a character of Shakespearean proportions whose tragedy was that he could never escape the violent world that made him, even as he reached for a world of light and legitimacy. His death was not a random act of violence. It was the inexorable conclusion of the life he had chosen, the final balance on a ledger of debt and betrayal. In the end, Benjamin Siegel was a gambler who made the biggest bet of his life on a patch of desert, staking not just money, but his very existence on the turn of a card. He lost that bet, but in doing so, he created the house that would forever define the game. His spirit, restless, ambitious, and forever hungry, is woven into the very fabric of Las Vegas, a city that, like its founder, is a beautiful, dangerous, and unforgettable gamble. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most compelling stories of the 20th century. If you found this exploration of the rise and fall of a criminal visionary enlightening, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel for more in-depth historical narratives, and hitting the notification bell so you never miss a story. We encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think is the most enduring part of Bugsy Siegel's legacy? Your engagement helps us continue to bring these complex tales to light. Thank you for watching.